For those of you not familiar with what the yamas are, let me just take half a step back. When we study yoga, most of us think that yoga means what we do with our bodies. A headstand, a handstand, trikonasana, lotus position, whatever I'm doing with my body. But actually, Sage Patanjali, who's known as the father of yoga, the sage of yoga, gave 8 limbs of yoga. And that's actually what's called Ashtanga yoga, those 8 limbs. And the very, very first of those limbs is the yamas. The second are the niyamas. And asana, which it's what most of us think of as yoga, is actually only limb number 3. And that's a really important distinction, because if we were going to build something, you can't start on the 3rd floor. Anyone who's ever built a house or a building or any kind of structure understands that the very first thing we have to do is dig deeply into the ground, lay a strong foundation, and the building can only go as high as the foundation is deep and strong. And so the yamas and the niyamas form the foundation of the structure of yoga. And then of course from asana we move all the way up through the other limbs until ultimately we get into samadhi, which is the 8th limb and the ultimate goal, that union that yoga means, which is a union of the self with the divine, a union of the self with the universe, the supreme, the higher self, God, whatever word or term or language we use to describe it. That's actually what the word yoga means. That union that yoga is not, as so many of us think about it, a union of just our head to our knee, or our union of our head to the ground in a headstand. It's ultimately a union of the self to the divine. So that being said, the very foundation of yoga is the yamas. And the very first of the yamas is Ahimsa, or non-violence, which means that regardless of how fabulous our headstand is, or regardless of how flexible our body might be, and how long we can sit in Padmasana, or how long we can hold a Trikonasana, or how many sun salutations we can do, regardless of that, if we're not living non-violence, then what we're doing isn't yoga, it's acrobatics, or it's calisthenics, or it's aerobics, or it's stretching, or it's any of these other terms that just describe what we do with our body. If it's yoga, it begins with non-violence. When most of us think about violence, though, we think about it literally as in something that goes out and hits someone. If I refrain from beating you up, I've achieved non-violence. But there's violence in word, in thought. How many of us have walked out of a yoga class and we're still in the dressing room getting dressed, and we find ourselves saying, oh my God, did you see what she was wearing? Or, God, she really put on a lot of weight over the weekend. Or, God, what was she thinking or he thinking when they said this? Gossip is violence. We're not even out of the yoga studio, and we're engaging in violence. Or violence to ourselves. How many of us in the yoga class itself berate ourselves with, you're no good at this, you'll never be anything, you're too fat, you're too tall, you're too old, you're too tight, you're too this, you're too that. Well, that's violence. It's violence toward the self. And so when we talk about nonviolence and ahimsa, we don't even have to get off the mat before we start to recognize all the different ways that we actually are violent to others, to ourselves. But then, of course, it goes into a completely other realm with how we live. What percentage of people who do yoga are vegetarians? What percentage of people who do yoga insist on only buying food that's organic or that's fair trade? How many of us, when we eat, when we shop, insist on buying products that aren't the cheapest, that aren't necessarily the ones whose advertisement we saw, that aren't made with real leather or real fur, but that were made by companies who are certified in fair trade, where we know that no women, no children were working in sweatshops to produce them, that we know that every employer received a fair wage and health benefits, that we know that they were produced organically, without toxic chemicals leaching into our soil, then into our groundwater, then into our rivers, toxifying the land and injuring the health of people downriver. Well, if we're not ensuring that what we eat, what we buy, how we shop is as non-violent as possible, then it doesn't matter what we're doing on the mat, it's not yoga. There's a push in commercialism, in the media, to keep buying more and more and more and more and more. And that push itself is violence, because everything that's produced is produced in a factory that's destroying our environment. So whatever we do, from the minute we wake up in the morning to the minute we go to sleep at night, we have the option and the opportunity to make it a choice for nonviolence. And lastly, what that actually ends up doing is, even if we're not spending time on a yoga mat, even if we're not learning the asanas, we're actually able to still be yogis from the very foundation. Yes, of course, learning the asanas is going to be wonderful for our body. Learning pranayama, moving up, is ideal. But if we're able to begin with ahimsa and satya and truthfulness and move through the yamas and niyamas in our life, then whatever we do becomes yoga.